Welcome to this rapid revision session on Anglo Saxon law and order. Let's get into it. The first thing we're going to have a look at is blood feuds, rather neatly summed up by this cartoon here. This idea was particularly common earlier in the Saxon period, but royal rule had increased somewhat by the 11th century and blood feuds were becoming a little bit less common. Under the blood feud, there was a legal framework for revenge. If a member of a family was murdered, that family was legally entitled to murder the member of the perpetrator's family in revenge, and so on, because they could then murder one of his relatives back. This meant that a bloody dispute could last for generations. Like that. However, the blood feud was intended as a form of deterrence. The consequences of a murder being potentially so long-lasting and devastating that it would put people off murdering their neighbours altogether. So that's how the blood feud worked. Or did it just create an even greater cycle of violence? Surely there had to be a better way. Perhaps here we've got that better way. Wergild. Wer meaning man, gild meaning gold. So if you think of a werewolf being a man-wolf, then hopefully that will help you remember that wergild is man-gold. But what does that actually mean? Well, we can see in this cartoon here, well, I say it's a cartoon, it's an illuminated manuscript drawing to which I've added some slightly humorous captions. We can see that there's been a person murdered and that someone else on the right is paying a fine. You can see coins dropping into the person's hand. So what was Wergild? Where there's blame, there's a claim. Wergild was a form of compensation for assaults and murders. People would be fined for causing harm and disablement, and fines for killing people. Wergild fines included, for a king, 30,000 gold coins. For a thane, 1,200 shillings. For a prosperous churl, so not your rank average peasant, 200 shillings. And strangely, for a Welshman, which would have been considered a foreigner at this time, perhaps a slightly racist 70 shillings is all that was offered. Although this might seem like a license for the rich to murder people, many of the fines for richer people really were crippling and acted as a deterrent. Even 200 shillings for the churl would be an incredibly large amount of money, equal to roughly £100 in weight of silver. That's quite a lot, even if you're very, very wealthy indeed. And so Wergild, as well as offering a chance for compensation, also acted as a deterrent. But if someone paid up this compensation, even if they felt that justice hadn't entirely been done, they'd be less likely to embark on their own blood feud of revenge. Revenge is all very well, but what if there's no real concrete proof as who's to blame? This is where trial by ordeal comes in. If there was a disagreement or no obvious culprit, the Saxons would leave justice to God. Trial by ordeal was one way of doing this. Here's how it worked. A person would be accused of a crime. Then the accused person would undergo some sort of painful and injuring process, perhaps holding a red-hot iron for 5 paces, or grasping a stone from the bottom of a boiling cauldron. Then they would obviously be wounded. The priest would bind the wound with a prayer. In fact, you can see some sort of clergyman giving a prayer over the cauldron in the illustration. So with the wound being bound and the prayers being said, there were 2 options. Option number 1. If the wound healed quickly and cleanly, then it was decided that God had judged them innocent and the person would be let go. However, if the wound failed to heal quickly or it became infected, it was considered that God had judged them guilty and a punishment would follow, whether this was a fine, a mutilation by cutting off a part of their body, an execution, or even sending them into exile. It begs the question, how did people feel about this? Well, the religious Anglo-Saxons would have truly believed that this was God's punishment and God's judgment, and so therefore they'd probably accept the judgments. But what about a person who realised that they were innocent? How would they feel if they knew they were innocent and yet the trial by ordeal had judged them guilty? Well, it's hard to say. They might feel quite hard done by. But, as people said at the time, God moves in mysterious ways. You weren't necessarily to understand what he was trying to decide. So you might think, for example, that if you were then executed, at least you'd end up in heaven as you had been wrongly convicted. Or perhaps God judging you as guilty on earth was just his way of getting you to join paradise that little bit quicker. or hell, if you really were guilty. Then we've got the hue and cry. Here we can see a man stealing a sheep. Naughty man. Anyway, the community was expected to uphold the law and assist in catching criminals. If someone witnessed a crime, for example a theft, they had a responsibility to raise the hue and cry by shouting and alerting others, like this. Hey, bear theof! That kind of means stop thief in Anglo Saxon English. They would then form a sort of posse, chasing them from town to town, if necessary, until they were delivered to the Shire Reeve. And here is our posse. And the woman is shouting, that is Mina Shiap. You can probably guess what that means. If 100 failed to raise the hue and cry, then the whole community would be fined as a form of collective punishment. So they had not only a moral responsibility to chase these things down, but there was a fine to back it up as well if you didn't. Remember, there was no police force at this time, and communicating with the Shire Reeve, even if you could find where on earth he was, would take so long that the miscreant would definitely get away. And so it was on communities themselves to try and act as a form of deterrence, and for where people did go against the law, to chase them down and try and do something about it. Ultimately, it was judged that the whole community would benefit as a result. So who enforced the law? The enforcement of the law was done in line with the Anglo Saxon Hierarchy. Here we can see King Edward. He looks like he's giving judgment to someone, although some interpretations of this scene say that that's him choosing Harold Godwinson as his successor. Anyway, I digress slightly. Local towns, often burghs, became centres of justice as well as of trade. So the king decided the law. In important cases, he could also act as judge. Below him, the earls ensured that the law was applied in their earldom. As the king's representative, he might also act as judge. Important lords were appointed as shire reeves or sheriffs. They prosecuted crimes, collected taxes and fines, and dished out the punishments. That meant that the king's subjects all were expected to obey the law, or they would be punished if they did not. Some final points then. Saxon England seems violent and lawless to us today, and I suppose compared to times today, it was. A good example to support this is the idea of blood feuds. But there was a system of law enforced by the king, his earls, and his shire reeves. Even the community was expected to assist in keeping law and order. Think of the hue and cry. And compensation could be paid for harming others, such as the Wergild. Fines, mutilation, exile, and execution were all most common punishments. However, imprisonment was rare. Prisons didn't really exist at all. God also judged people in cases without concrete proof, as we saw in Trial by Ordeal. So that just about covers Anglo-Saxon law and order. Hope it's been useful to you. If it has, please like this video, and if you need more content like this, please subscribe to the channel, as I'll be adding lots of different videos in the weeks to come. If it's something that you're desperate for me to do a revision video on, please make a comment in the comments below, and I'll take that suggestion on board and see if I can move that one up the list. Other than that, I'll say thank you very much, thanks for watching, and goodbye.